is the second video out of two over chapter 21, which is Imperial America or American Empire. We talked about America turning outward right before 1900 because we have settled the West, we have industrialized, we are looking for the first time outward. And the place we begin to look is Cuba, which has started a resistance against very decrepit Spanish control. We step in to help the poor oppressed Cuban people, quote unquote, and we succeed in pushing them out of Cuba with the help of Teddy Roosevelt and his very famous Rough Riders, because most of them were cowboys with a few polo players thrown in there. The war against Spain starts 1898, and you have to look at where Spain has other territories because we declare war on Spain. So that includes all of the territory that Spain controls. Obviously, she controls several things in the Caribbean. Puerto Rico is another one, Cuba. But she also controls other parts of empire. Now, Spain has been an empire for 400 years. She no longer has the money or the power to control a lot of the territories that she used to 300 years earlier. So the other place we immediately become involved with shortly after Cuba is in the Philippines. We are at war with Spain. We send a naval contingent to Manila Harbor, where the Pacific Spanish fleet is anchored, and Admiral Dewey, the American admiral in charge, pretty much annihilates the entire Spanish fleet with something like 400 Spanish casualties over 5 hours and a grand total of 6 American, not even killed, but wounded. So with almost no damage, we destroyed the Pacific Fleet of Spain. He sunk 3 ships, he scuttled another 6, and Spain is no longer a power in the Pacific. We are. Remember that the Pacific became known as America's Lake, not Spain's lake. The Filipinos, the native Filipinos, who had been not happy with Spanish control for a long time. Again, a lot of Spanish plantations, a lot of wealthy Spanish landlords controlling a lot of very poor Filipino peasants as workers. And the Filipino leader, a man named Aguinaldo, met with Dewey and said, yes, let's push Spain out. The assumption was, of course, then we can take over. And he met with Dewey, agreed to help the Americans to defeat Spain, very quick victory, and the Filipinos naturally assumed that, okay, now America will let us go ahead and create our own government now that we've gotten rid of Spain. Instead, America stayed for very close to 50 years in the Philippines. We didn't leave until after the end of World War II. And the question, of course, is why are we there for 50 years? Quoting from our Secretary of State, the evolution of events have brought these problems upon the United States due to God's plans and methods for human progress, unquote. This is manifest destiny. That's my line, but that's exactly what they're talking about. President McKinley, quote, "There is nothing left for us to do but to educate, uplift, and civilize and Christianize the Filipino nation." Okay? Filipinos are what religion then and now? Over 80% Catholic, and they had been Catholic for over 300 years. But according to American perceptions, which was a Protestant nation, of course, there's nothing left for us to do but educate, uplift, civilize, and Christianize the Filipinos. The Filipinos were a little surprised at that. McKinley uses the war powers of Congress. He has to get congressional approval because Congress votes the money, which they do. And he sent something like, over a period of several years, 120,000 American troops. At its peak, 70,000 Americans were in the Philippines. The Filipinos disagreed with our plans to Christianize and civilize them. They resist. They had resisted Spain before us. They assumed that the Americans were going to be allies of them. They were until Spain was defeated, and then they turn around and they fight for their independence from us. They saw us, quite logically, as an invading power. So there is a long, nasty, vicious, brutal jungle guerrilla warfare. Starting with slide 14, and the next couple of photos are just, and drawings are just some of the warfare that was going on in the Philippines. Both sides. Who started what? It's hard to determine. Long, nasty massacres on both sides, torture on both sides, atrocities on both sides, civilians killed right and left in Philippine villages. Americans started doing scorched earth, which basically destroy anything of any use to the enemy. So crops were burned in the fields, villages were burned down. Interesting sidelight of this, it is the Filipinos who taught the American army about waterboarding. This came from Spain through the Philippines. The Spain had used it during the Inquisition, introduced it into the Philippines introduced it to us. Civilians were herded into basically concentration camps, many people killed, many people wounded. They cut off food to the entire civilian population when they could. They figured 1 out of 6 people on the island of Luzon, one of the big islands in the Philippines, died in this conflict. We don't know how many Filipinos died from different causes. They estimate at least 50,000. The number is probably much higher. We do have an American death count of 4,300 killed in this war. As the war drags on, about the second year into the war, the American commander-in-chief calls his officers in, and this is, I'm quoting him verbatim because this is written down in military records, and he orders his officers, and I'm quoting, "I want all persons killed who are capable of bearing arms." And one of his generals was a little surprised and appalled by this and asked openly, "At what age do we do this?" And his response was 10 years old. If they can pick up a gun, I want them killed. So this is what is going on in the Philippines for several years. It finally ended with Aguinaldo, the leader of the Filipino resistance movement. He was told to come in under a white flag of truce and we'll negotiate a settlement and stop all the brutality. He came in under a white flag. They tricked him. They threw him in prison. And when he was in prison, the resistance kind of dissipated and fell apart. So this is a really interesting background today. The Philippines has a real mixed relationship with America and has been. We were there for almost 50 years, but in the beginning, this is a nasty, vicious, brutal guerrilla war. And then we went in and we did what America does very well around the world. We rebuilt the infrastructure. We built roads and telegraphs and telephones and hospitals and clinics and schools and bridges and water treatment plants and everything else. So it's a love-hate relationship for a long time with the Philippines because we did a lot of good things, but we also were involved in a nasty little war to start out with. A lot of Filipinos, not so much in Texas, but if you go to California, I had some experience with this the last couple of years. The whole medical system in California is pretty much staffed by Filipinos, from specialists and doctors to nurses to home health care aides. The entire medical system is Filipino now. So they have favored entry, basically, status because they were under our control for a long time. So the reaction to this war, not everybody in America was for this. There was strong support for the war in Cuba, but in the Philippines, there was quite a bit of opposition. Many progressives, war is not a progressive measure. Some congressmen were against it. There was a lot of bribery going on in Congress, money passing hands. Andrew Carnegie, was totally against the war, and he offered President McKinley $20 million to get out of the Philippines just because he felt it was wrong. to occupy the Philippines. McKinley did not take it, but Carnegie can do that. He has lots of money. Henry Adams, one of our leading academics at the time, a great quote about the war in the Philippines: "We must slaughter 1,000,000 foolish Malays in order to give them the comforts of flannel petticoats and electric railways." Another senator in Congress: "Today we are doing in the Philippines what we made war on Spain for doing in Cuba. We are doing the same thing in the Philippines that we accused the Spanish of doing in Cuba," which was more or less correct. Reporter on the ground: "It is not civilized warfare, but we are not dealing with a civilized people. The only thing they know and fear is force, violence, and brutality, and we gave it to them." So this is the attitude and the image of the Philippines in American eyes in the early 1900s. Now, another issue. What do you do with the Philippines once you have put down the resistance? We stayed for 50 years. The impression at the time by most Americans is this was clearly an inferior people, as they called it. Filipinos are mixed race. They are Malay. They are Asian. There was a lot of African slaves brought there. They are clearly darker, which is a key thing in American history. What do you do? Cuba, of course, you had the Teller Amendment. In Cuba, we promised before we entered the war not to annex, but to help them get independence, which we did after Cuba. We left 10,000 troops in Cuba for several years to build the infrastructure, again, the schools, the roads, the bridges, the hospitals, etc. We established a local government, which was largely controlled by Americans. And after 4 years, we left Cuba. We kept our promise. We helped them get back in order. They set up a government, and we pulled out, except, of course, for Guantanamo Bay, which we kept as a military base, which we still own. We wanted a presence in Cuba because when we left, we had $50 million worth of land owned by Americans, and about 50,000 Americans had moved to Cuba to run farms, to run factories, whatever. Cuba was producing and sending to America about half of our sugar as well. Hawaii, the other half at this time. Now, Cuba is nearby. The Philippines is a long way away. So what do you do with the Philippines? We helped build the infrastructure. We set up a military rule. This was military, controlled by the Army, no legal process, no civil rights. In some Supreme Court cases called the Insular cases, this was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court that Filipinos had no civil rights that Americans have. And we stayed for 50 years. The question was, do we annex the Philippines? Do we make them into American territory? And this is a furious debate in the country and also in Congress. Clearly, there's 10 million citizens in the Philippines. This would be a great market for the surplus manufacturing that we have. Another factor arguing for annexing the Philippines, of course, is other countries in Europe are taking over the Belgian Congo and the British in South Africa and in India. People are moving into China. America is a great and powerful nation. We don't have any colonies. Maybe the Philippines should be our colonies. More to the point, we consider them unfit for self-government, so we better take over until they become fit in our eyes. It is a long way away. It will increase the U.S. government cost. We have to, if we take over this territory, it's going to be very expensive to rule and to take care of. And probably the most important point is flat out American racism, to put it bluntly. The Philippines had over 70 different dialects in the country. They had much darker people, mixed race people, which is a big problem in American eyes. And again, another quote from a senator, they are but little advanced from pure savagery. They are savages running around the jungle. That's how we saw them. One South Carolina senator, we don't need any more colored citizens. So the combination of American racism and the factor of distance, we leave the Philippines alone. We keep them under American control, but we eventually pull out after World War II. We did not annex them. We did not make them a territory. The Treaty of Paris, at the end of 1898, after Spain has surrendered, we took over all of the Spanish territory, but at the same time, we paid Spain $20 million. Why are we paying off Spain? To make it look legitimate, that we're not actually taking her territory, we are actually paying her for it. The real irony is America, which was the first colonial country to revolt against Britain or any other country, now has an empire, now has the equivalent of colonies. So Cuba, we left quickly. The Philippines, we stayed for 50 years. The other areas that we take over, Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico, of course, has been in the news, so we know all about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico becomes a protectorate under our protection in the Caribbean, becomes a territory. They are granted U.S. citizenship in 1917. So again, it has been in the news. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. They can come and go anytime they want from the continental United States. They have citizenship. What they don't have is congressional representation. They do not vote in presidential elections, neither does Washington, D.C. The other factor, they do not pay income taxes, federal income taxes. And up till now, Puerto Rico has always voted down states becoming a state. They want to stay a territory because they don't have to pay income tax until about 10 years ago when they went absolutely flat broke. And now they're saying, okay, now we would like to become a state. We don't mind paying the federal income taxes because at least we'll get more money back from the federal government. This is still an open question. Will Puerto Rico ever become a state? It certainly has enough people to become a state. It has the population, and they are U.S. citizens. As of now, they are still a territory. Their first governor in the early 1900s, after he was governor of Puerto Rico, became the president of Domino Sugar. So you know what's going on in Puerto Rico. They can also be drafted. Puerto Ricans fought in both world wars for the United States. Other areas that we got that were under former Spanish control, Guam and Samoa, in the middle of the Pacific. Why do we want these places? These are very good stopping places, very good footholds in the Pacific, well beyond Hawaii. These are tiny little islands. They can never have enough population to become a state. So they're not even big enough to become a territory like Puerto Rico. What they are protectorates. They are under American, essentially, naval control. They are naval bases today. They have good harbors in Samoa and Guam, not as good as Hawaii, but good enough for naval investment. Guam, when we took over Guam, the island of Guam, it was under Spanish control. Spain had not even informed its 56 soldiers on the island that Spain was at war with the United States. American warships sailed into the little harbor there. The 56 Spanish soldiers were completely shocked. They didn't know what to do, and they surrendered without firing a shot. They didn't have much choice. There were only 56 of them in a pretty decrepit fort. Similar story in Samoa. These are territories. Samoans and natives of Guam can travel back and forth to the United States with no restrictions because they are technically our property. Samoans have been in the news the last 10, 15 years. Samoans are Polynesians. They're big guys. And if you look around the NFL, there's a good handful of Samoans that have been recruited for the NFL to play. They don't have any issues with immigration. They are technically under American control. The other area we go into in the Caribbean that had also been under Spanish control is Haiti. And Haiti has been a basket case for a long time. It was under American control for decades, again, until shortly after World War II. We went in when the Spanish moved out. We did what America does best. We built the infrastructure, the roads, the hospitals, the clinics, the schools, the telephones, the whole infrastructure. For 72 years, we occupied Haiti. And the minute we left, Haiti disintegrated again, and still is. If you remember 10 years ago, that earthquake that hit Haiti devastated the country. Everybody was donating money to Haiti, and then everybody forgot about Haiti. We haven't heard about Haiti for a long time. There are still 500,000 people in Haiti today that are living under plastic sheets, not even tents, but sheets of plastic in the Caribbean. In the years that we left after World War II, I'm not making this up, Haiti has had 102 political revolutions to change its government. It has had 22 presidents. Of the 22 presidents it's had, only 4 died of natural causes. 13 were killed in coups, and 2 of the 13 were torn into pieces in the street by their own people. So Haiti is an ongoing problem. If you Google map it and you look at the island of Haiti, Dominican Republic and Haiti share an island. And you can actually see this from aerial space photographs. The Haitian side of the island is completely bare. The Dominican Republic side looks pretty normal from an aerial view. What happened in Haiti when they had a slave revolt about 1800, the rest of the world cut them off completely. And they had no resources. They basically environmentally destroyed their half of the island. They have never been able to recover. So Haiti is an ongoing problem. It still is at the moment. They do have a more or less functioning democracy. Economically, it is in dire straits. It has been in dire straits actually pretty much off and on since World War II, and will continue that way for a while. Environmentally, it's a total disaster. So we have an American empire. Now we have taken over Spanish lands all over the world. If you look at slide 19 in that file, the long-term effects of the Spanish-American War had a lot of important effects on America. This is a war we rarely hear about. I had no idea in high school that we even had a war with Spain. It was never taught to us. One thing I have touched on already, it absolutely increased racism in America and also overseas. This whole issue of the dark races, of dark people, we have enough dark citizens, as that South Carolina senator said. Cubans are also dark, a lot of African and native blood mixed in Cubans. The other factor with racism is that, remember, in Cuba, 1/4 of the soldiers were smoked Yankees, were African American troops. They come back, they have fought for the United States, a number of them died, and nothing has changed in America. They have segregation. They are discriminated against, and some of them fight back. Some of those who fought back were killed, including 4 in U.S. Army uniforms, were killed for standing up against segregation in southern states. Another effect of the Spanish-American War is increased isolationism. Isolationism means America wants to withdraw within itself, wants to isolate itself from the rest of the world. We don't want to interact. Because of these brutal wars in Cuba, and even more so in the Philippines, most Americans reacted quite logically as, why are we messing around in these places? Does any of this sound familiar? And this is a direct connection. When World War I comes along, it takes us 2 years to get involved in the war because, hey, we've been there before. We don't need to get involved with other people's problems. If you want to update this, America first, no foreign entanglements. So this has long-term echoes. It did modernize the U.S. military. We increased our army, and we actually had a decent-sized standing army, 4 times as big as it was before. We set up officer training schools, which did not exist before the Spanish-American War. The National Guard was put under federal supervision, as well as the states. And for the first time, we have a Pentagon. We didn't have the building then, but for the first time, there is a central office with a general staff and a chief of staff that coordinates all the branches of the military. Because up to the Spanish-American War, the Army didn't talk to the Navy didn't talk to the Marines didn't talk to the Coast Guard, nobody coordinated anything. We realized in the Spanish-American War, the Navy has to coordinate with the Army and the Marines to get anything done. So now we have a central staff. The other thing it did is make America a world political power. She was an economic power in the world. Now she becomes, quote unquote, a great power equal to European nations, if not better and stronger than them. It changes how we look at ourselves. We are now a world leader, not only economically, but politically as well. The other side effect of the Spanish-American War, we tend to forget history, it is our first encounter with Asian warfare and particularly jungle warfare. So when we go into Vietnam 60 years later, we should have learned some lessons, but we didn't. Because we should have learned jungle warfare and guerrilla warfare is nasty, brutal, vicious to everyone involved. So some long-term effects of the Spanish-American War. Stay safe, stay well out there.